there's ample evidence to suggest that these new mutations may signal the beginning of the end of the pandemic with regards to COVID-19. There's evidence suggests that there's this trade-off between virulence and transmissibility. And as pathogens become more transmissible, that is, they're more infectious, the ability of one person to infect more people increases. That comes at an expense, and that expense is reduced virulence or pathogenicity, that is, the severity of the disease. So in an ideal world, what pathogens or obligate intracellular parasites, that is a virus, what they like to do is strive to find this balance between optimal transmissibility and reduce virulence, because what that means for the pathogen that is trying to amplify its ability to infect more and more people, because again, these pathogens can't live, viruses, particularly SARS-CoV-2, can't live by itself. It needs your glucose, your amino acids, it needs your cells to hijack. So if it can not kill you and infect you and your family members and your friends, that's an ideal environment. It turns out that the location of these ACE2 receptors, which are found in your own tissues, this is how the virus, sort of this lock and key mechanism. I'm making loose analogies here if you're watching on YouTube. So you have the spike protein and you have this, sort of female end on your own receptors called the ACE2 receptor. These mutations really increase this affinity. Now, in fact, let me just read to you some direct quotes from some of the papers that we're going to refer to in the show notes below here. We showed that Omicron is about 10 times more infectious as the original virus and about twice as infectious as the Delta variant. Now, some other scientists in the Lancet go on to say the rate of infection from this Omicron variant will be 100-fold higher as compared to Delta. When pathogens become more transmissible, they usually lose some of their virulent or disease-forming capacity. And guess what? These new mutations have caused just that. More and more data is showing that, to the best of my knowledge at the time of recording this video on December 8th, there has been no deaths attributed to this Omicron variant. In fact, it's been a bunch of mild cases. You're going to look at this image right here that shows human cold-causing coronaviruses and seasonal influenza viruses. They're highly transmissible, and they're not as lethal as SARS-CoV-2. Why? Why is that? Because they tend to infect the upper part of the airway, the epithelial tissue in the upper part of the respiratory tract, compared to the lower respiratory tract, which is where more lethal pathogens such as SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, the Gen 1 version, if we think about the OG version of SARS-CoV-2, it really didn't have a preference as to where it bind. It would cause infections in some people in the lower airways and some people in the upper airways, and that might have been the differentiating factor between severe disease and mild disease. These new mutations foster enhanced receptor binding to the ACE2, which is found primarily in the upper airway epithelial tissue. So essentially, as scary as this new variant sounds, 30 plus mutations, it's heavily mutated. These are the things you're hearing about from pundits on television. Okay, those are good because those mutations are preferentially causing the virus to infect the airway epithelia in the upper airway portion. As you can see here, more benign cold-causing coronaviruses and influenza preferentially affect the upper airway epithelial tissue. ACE2 expression follows a gradient along the respiratory tract with greater expression in the upper airway and decreasing further down. If you think about, well, there's a lot of receptors up here, so it's probably unlikely that the virus is going to get into your airway, miss all of these ACE2 receptors and go down where they're less prominent in the lower airway. So again, what this means is these mutations have rendered SARS-CoV-2 to a cold, like has been, these endemic coronaviruses. There's about 5 of them that circulate. They infect kids all the time. About 40% of the common, cold that people get is from these coronaviruses. The location in which viruses replicate along the respiratory tract guides how the virus will be able to transmit and also its pathogenicity. Traditionally, viruses that bind to the upper airway exhibit lower pathogenicity compared with the other viruses that bind to the lower airways. So again, that trade-off, right? If the virus preferentially, binds to the airway tissue up here, it's more transmissible and it's not as virulent, which is the optimal scenario for a virus to remain endemic. So the scientists want to say that testing for these less virulent human cold-causing coronaviruses typically find positive results when samples are done in the upper airway compared to the lower airway. In contrast, with SARS-CoV-1 and MERS that occurred in the early 2000s, rarely were there ever samples found when sampling in the upper airway. It was mostly in the lower airway. Now remember, those viruses were not as transmissible, but they were highly lethal. The case fatality ratio was something like 20 to 30%. So very deadly. If you got those diseases, even if you're metabolically healthy, I mean, if you got infected with those bugs, even if you're metabolically healthy, probability of surviving was not so hot. So in conclusion, one hypothesis argues that the strength of the receptor affinity may correlate with the receptor abundance in an inverse relationship, meaning that if a virus can preferentially bind here, that's where it's going to infect the upper airway. So really important stuff here. I think it's really good news. And these are scientists here at this was University of Texas Medical Branch. So I feel a little sheepish putting this out there premature before all the experts, so to speak, are talking about it. But it seems that these mutations are actually good because this renders this pathogen that can be pretty virulent for some people, especially if you have underlying health conditions, if you're overweight, if you're obese, if you're elderly. And if this renders this to a common cold that just causes a little upper respiratory tract infection and not severe systemic disease and pneumonia and compromising lung function, that is good news. And if I'm wrong, I have that right to be wrong, just as all the other health experts pretty much throughout the world. Many people have been wrong, like wrong about closing down the economy, suggesting it saves lives. It just prevented transmission or delayed the onset of that. Closing schools, really bad idea. There's a lot of iatrogenesis, and there's no indication that the lack of school closures in Sweden and Europe impacted children in a negative way compared to what we did here in the US, right? So based upon this data, I really hope I'm right. And I'm sure you probably hope I'm right as well, because we all want this thing to end.